Hey, this is Jeremy with Old Line Woodworking. Today I'm going to show you how I made this end grain cutting board for a friend's birthday. Follow along and you can make one just like it. First, I needed to head to my local lumber supplier to pick up some stock for this project. I get all of my hardwoods from Exotic Lumber in Annapolis, Maryland. They stock over 150 species of wood in various thicknesses and lengths. I picked a 9-foot long, 5-inch wide board of 5/4 walnut. Before grabbing an 8-foot long, 5-inch wide board of 5/4 hard maple. I had them cut the boards in half for me so they would better fit in my car. After paying for the lumber, I headed back to my shop and got to work. I first set a stop block at 19 inches and began to cut the stock down to rough size to make it easier to flatten on my joiner. I ended up with 2 boards of walnut and 2 boards of hard maple. I adjusted my joiner to take off about 1/32 of an inch on each pass, before flattening one side of each of my 4 boards. I then flattened one edge of each piece, giving me a flat and square face and edge. I made sure that the blade on my table saw was square, and then ran through each of the 4 boards, cutting off the remaining rough edge, providing 2 parallel and flat edges. It was now time to lug out my planer to flatten the other face of each board. I really need to build a rolling cart for the planer, because at about 90 pounds, it is a huge pain to lug around. I ran each board through and brought the total thickness of each one down to 1 inch thick. I was then able to pack back up and put away the planer now that I had my milled stock completed. I set the fence of my table saw to 1 inch and adjusted the blade height for the boards, having the gullet in the blade be just higher than the thickness of the board. I then ran through each board, getting a total of 8 1-inch wide, 1-inch thick pieces of hard maple, and 8 similar dimensioned pieces of walnut. It was now time to prepare for the first glue up. I arranged the strips in an alternating pattern of maple and walnut. I rotated each strip 90 degrees, except for the last one. I used Titebond 3 as the glue for this project, relying on its waterproof properties to make sure the board doesn't fall apart. I applied a generous amount of glue to each piece of wood, then spread it out. You could use a silicone brush for this, but I don't have one, so I just used my finger. Making sure that each piece is completely covered in glue, I then clamped up the panel. I made sure to apply pressure from both the top and bottom of the panel to help prevent warping. I used a wet rag on both faces of the new single panel to wipe off as much squeeze out as I could. Doing this now will save me time later when it comes time to sand. I added cauls to both sides, just as some additional insurance to help prevent warping of the final glued up panel. With that, I called it a day and let the glue dry overnight. The next day I came back and checked the panel. It was quite flat and fairly smooth. I then did a light sanding on both sides with 120 grit sandpaper to smooth out the panel before cutting it down to strips. Using the miter gauge, I trimmed off the rough edge of the panel, giving myself a flat edge to use as a reference surface against the fence. I adjusted the fence to 1 5/8 of an inch. This would be the final thickness of the cutting board. I then cut the panel into a total of 10 strips. I moved the strips over and prepared them for final glue up. I flipped over every other piece to make a checkerboard pattern for the final board. Again, I rotated every strip 90 degrees to apply another liberal coating of Type Bond 3. Just like the first glue up, I wiped down both faces of the panel to remove as much squeeze out as possible. I again used cauls on both sides to help prevent warping. Now I took a moment to watch the glue dry. Since I had some time, I took the opportunity to clean up my shop a little. There was a lot of sawdust on the floor. And now that the sawdust was clear, I could roll around on my stool a little bit. With the glue drying, the shop somewhat clean, and the stool sufficiently rolled, it was time to call it a night again. Back for the final day, I returned to my shop and began to unclamp the cutting board for the final time. This glue out turned out great, nice and smooth and dead flat. I sanded the board with 120 grit before finishing with 220 grit. I got my router out to cut some handles to make the lifting the board a little easier. I started by installing a 1/2 inch cove bit. I measured and marked where I wanted the cutouts to be. I made marks 3 inches apart, centered on both ends of the board. Using 2 pieces of tape, I marked where the cuts should start and stop. I lined up my marks to the bit and then applied tape right to the fence for my reference points. I cut out both handles using the tape reference points for where I should start and stop both cuts. I was now finished with my router and I put it away. And then it was time for even more sanding. I went over the edges again and made sure to break all the hard corners. Then I hand sanded the cutouts to smooth them out and remove any burn marks left by the router. Look at how well those handles work. Then, just a little more final sanding. It was now ready for finish. I wiped on 3 coats of mineral oil, allowing each coat to soak in before applying the next. For the fourth and final coat, I measured 100 grams of mineral oil and about 30 grams of beeswax. I cut the wax into small chunks so that they would melt a little bit easier. Using a double boiler, I melted the beeswax into the mineral oil, stirring often while melting it. Once it was fully melted, I transferred the mixture to a container to cool, stirring often to ensure that the wax didn't separate from the oil. After allowing the mixture to cool completely, it'll be roughly the consistency of glue. Using a clean cloth, I buffed the wax onto both sides and all four edges. This step provides a barrier to protect the board from water, but will need to be repeated every few months to avoid warping. And that's how I made this end green cutting board. Thanks so much for watching, and please like and subscribe. Ugh, what a mess.